Good evening, everyone. My name is Claire Meehan, and I'm chair of the Education Committee of Seniors for Climate Action Now, or SCAN. So on behalf of SCAN and our co-hosts, Environmentalists and Climate Action Muskoka, I'm incredibly pleased to welcome all of you to this special event with our distinguished guest speaker, Gordon Laxer. Before we begin, or as a first step in this evening's program, on behalf of everyone present, most of us living in Ontario, some in Quebec, I would like to put forward an acknowledgement that we are settlers on lands from which Indigenous peoples were dispossessed by colonialism using Western tactics, starting with the original so-called peace and friendship treaties, through the numbered treaties to the modern so-called settlements and agreements. Tonight, respectfully, we honor the ways of being of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and in particular, their loving stewardship and protection of the lands, waters, and life that make up Turtle Island. We collectively stand for the struggle to return public lands to the stewardship of Indigenous peoples, to respect and uphold this proven spirit of the treaties that colonial powers negotiated duplicitously and that modern governments continue to misinterpret willfully. And finally, we are together here to learn the truth about the historic relationship between Indigenous peoples and settlers, and such that we can build a relationship that is right and just. Now to this evening's program. We have three sponsoring organizations who have developed a collaborative and productive relationship in presenting these climate events in virtual format. Environmentalists is a small nonprofit organization that provides education on environmental and climate issues, as well as encouraging governments at all levels to increase ambition on climate action and sustainability. And it's represented this evening by Susan Hay. Climate Action Muskoka is an inclusive, nonpartisan group formed in 2019 to drive climate solutions to the district of Muskoka. Through CAM's efforts, climate emergencies were declared unanimously by the district and 5 municipalities to achieve a 50% reduction in GHG emissions by 2030 and zero by 2050. CAM also promotes residential and business GHG emission reductions through its Community Carbon Challenge. Seniors for Climate Action Now was formed in 2020, in mid-2020, and is a fast-growing organization of seniors dedicated to working with youth, Indigenous peoples, and other groups in the climate movement to achieve a clear vision of what the climate emergency consists of and to take decisive action to stop it. The websites of all three organizations have already been put in the chat. Now, this evening, in a minute or so, Terry Moore, member of Environment Halliburton and host of the radio program Planet Halliburton on Canoe FM, will introduce our guest, Gordon Laxer. You might be interested to know that Terry, in fact, interviewed Gordon earlier this week, and that program is being aired, in fact, as we speak, and will be aired again on Saturday, and we'll put that information in the chat as well. After Gordon's presentation, Terry will handle the Q&A. You please be sure to put your questions into the chat, and you can start to do that during the presentation as well as at the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentation, my colleagues, Sue McKenzie and Susan Hay, will kick off the question period with a couple of key questions, and then we will open the floor to all your questions. So remember, you can enter them at any time. So I think we're set to go. So Terry, over to you to introduce Gordon.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Claire. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you for that introduction and the land acknowledgement. So Claire has already gone through the chat. What I'll plan to do at the end of Gordon's presentation is I'll curate the chat, put together maybe some of the questions that may be on similar themes or across themes. And so I encourage you, as Gordon's presentation proceeds, to put stuff in the chat function, and I'll come to that after the first commenters. at the end of Gordon's presentation. So many of us don't need much of a introduction to Professor Gordon Laxer. He's been around on the Canadian left for quite some time. And he's a political economist, professor emeritus at the University of Alberta, and the founding director of the Parkland Institute. He's the author of 2 award-winning books, After the Sands, Energy and Ecological Security for Canadians, and Open for Business, The Roots of Foreign Ownership in Canada. Professor Laxer was the principal investigator of a $1.9 million 4-year four-country research project entitled Neoliberal Globalism and Its Challengers, Reclaiming the Commons in the Semi-Periphery. Gordon regularly writes op-eds for newspapers, including 2 recent ones on tonight's topic in the Toronto Star and the Edmonton Journal. He's a regular guest on current affairs, radio, and television programs, including the CBC's The Current, As It Happens, and Face Off. Please join me in welcoming Gordon Laxer, tonight's featured presenter. Over to you, Gordon. Can you share your screen with us?
Yeah, screen. Yeah. Yes, I learned a lot in my research. Some things surprised me, and I think they may you as well. So I'll get right into it. First, I want to do a quote from one of my intellectual heroes, George Grant, who wrote the book Lament for a Nation, The Defeat of Canadian Nationalism. He said, foreign capital is able to determine possible governments by incarnating itself as a national ruling class, and that was the problem that Canada faced. Okay, so I want to expose the power of big foreign oil, because their deceit makes it, enables them to manipulate Canadians and their governments. And why do they deceive? Because profit at any cost is their business model. So why this report now? Well, we know that democracy is threatened in many places, parts of the world, not least south of the border. There's been a big issues of foreign interests using power and money to influence politics in other countries, the intrusion by foreign governments. Those have been big issues in the United Kingdom, in France and Israel and other countries. The best known example was the alleged Russian interference in the 2016 US election. But governments are not the only powerful foreign intruders. Big corporations, especially big oil, regularly ignore democratic norms, and they use their economic and political power to win petrol-friendly policies in other countries, and they hinder effective climate action. So I'm first going to go into what big oil knew and when they knew it. And the reason I'm doing this is that people may have a naive sense of, well, you know, they just want to talk and let's work with them. Well, big oil has known way before most of us did that fossil fuels caused climate change, and that was going to be very destructive. And they knew it from the 1950s. So here, there was a conference that the American Petroleum Institute had with Columbia University, and they brought in Edward Teller, who was a famous physicist, nuclear physicist at the time. And he told so this was a day-long meeting, all of the big oil companies are there. And what Teller said in 1959 was that carbon dioxide has a strange property. It absorbs the infrared radiation, which is emitted from the Earth, and it causes a greenhouse effect. So he went on to say that, it could be sufficient to melt the ice cap and to submerge New York City. And he said all coastal cities in the world would be covered by the rising sea level. So Big Oil knew way back in 1959. I'm going to introduce you to Ben Franta, who's a professor in Stanford University, specializes in climate change politics. So he says in his research that American oil's awareness of global warming and its conspiracy of deceit and obstruction goes further than any one company. It's not just ExxonMobil, but the whole industry is implicated to its core by the history of its largest representatives, big lobby group, the American Petroleum Institute. So Big Oil knew for over 6 decades that their products were causing destruction on a massive scale. And not only did they do nothing about that, they spent a lot of money to deceive the public about what was happening. So the strategy of Big Oil is to talk, pump, and profit. Well, there is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers is the little Canadian little brother of the API, the American Petroleum Institute, representing many of the same corporations. And they learn from big tobacco that you deny the harmful effects. And they did that for up until the early part of this century. But by about 2007, they realized they had to change tactics. And now they pretend to be part of the solution, not only part of the solution, central to the solution. So, but while they talk, they want to continue talking, they pump and profit, and they make tens of millions of dollars a day, as long as we don't actually scale back their destructive work. So their business model is profit over people and planet. Well, I'm going to focus on Alberta. Alberta produces 80% of Canada's oil and about 70% of its natural gas. So it is the oil and gas powerhouse in Canada. I'm going to go back to 1995. There was something called the National Task Force, Oil Sands Task Force, and it said we're going to have economic benefits for Alberta and for Canada if you adopt our plan. Well, you hear a national task force, we think, this is something that's in the public interest and governments would be involved. But it was actually led by 6 foreign-owned tar sands corporations to write their own royalty rules. And a royalty, the oil companies pay royalties to whoever owns it, to the people. It's usually in Canada, it's the provinces that own and First Nations that own the oil. And so what the big foreign-owned tar sands corporation said is, bring in this regime and basically give us free oil, and we will pay 1% royalty for a very long time. So when the task force came out, there were 36 stories in Canadian newspapers on the task force. Only 3 of them mentioned that it was dominated by the oil corporations. None of the news stories said that they were foreign-owned corporations. Only 2 noted that Eric Newell, and I'm going to introduce Eric Newell in a minute, that he was the head of Syncrude, the president of Syncrude, but he was the head of the task force, and he was also president of the Alberta Chamber of Resources, all at the same time. Well, I've studied along with Reagan Boychuk how much Alberta has lost because of this sweetheart deal that the big foreign oil made with the Alberta government, and they brought the federal government in, has agreed to this as well. We compared the amount of money per barrel that Norway took from its North Sea oil compared to Alberta from its bitumen oil, from its tar sands. And the cost of production in both places is quite similar. If you can believe it, Norway got $70 a barrel from its North Sea oil over the 20-year period, and Alberta got under $5 a barrel. That is the difference, an incredible scale of ripoff. Well, this is Eric Newell. He was the one that led this task force. And he said, even before they got this regime, oil regime of basically free oil, he said, we, in a low price environment, we still make money. It's a steady lower rate of return. But if the price goes up, we just print money. So I did the study I did, it wasn't in this report, but it was in a complementary report that's going to come out. The post-tax profits from the tar sands to foreign owners, just the foreign owner part of that, 40 billion a year from 2009 to 2018. Those profits didn't even touch down in Canada. They just left the country. And the scale of that amount that leaves every year is over 70% of Alberta's annual budget spending. Well, what did Eric Newell do when he left the oil industry? He became Chancellor of the University of Alberta. Just shows the influence of big oil in Alberta. Well, we saw in November that the world leaders met in Glasgow to talk about what to do with the climate change. And Greta Thunberg said, it's just been blah, blah, blah. And a number of people may have thought that she went too far in saying that, and they should recognize that maybe some good steps have been taken. This is a graph I'm showing you on the cumulative global fossil fuel use since 1750. And if you look in 1990 was when we first, well, really 1992, the first time that the leaders of the world got together to try and deal with climate change. Since that time, half of the fossil fuels, the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, have been produced since they started talking. And you can see that graph is increased and has gone up on this kind of level. So basically, she's right that it's been blah, blah, blah. They have not taken action that has done very much to even slow things down. Well, governments talk a good game. We hear our own government saying that they're going to reduce carbon emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030, but then they don't deliver. Well, why don't they? They don't because to understand why they don't, you understand the political power of vested interests to profit. And we have to understand that so citizens can overcome that power. And we can, if we, governments can be powerful if we get them moving in the right direction. So how does big oil exert its power, these vested interests? Perpetual lobbying, election funding, advertising, and greenwashing, all kinds of illusions. They keep putting up false solutions. Even that term net zero. We used to talk about getting down to an 80% reduction by 2050. Now they say net zero. It sounds better because it's got zero. But there is so much, there's carbon capture, there's a whole bunch of false solutions in there where in fact the oil companies probably will be way less of reduction than 80%. Net zero can be very misleading. There's also, we face the problem of the dominant ideology, the neoliberal ideology, which is we've had since the early 80s when Thatcher and Reagan got elected. They said, leave it to the market to solve the problems. And when they say that, it means leave it to the big corporations. So in the oil industry, that's leave it to big oil. And the capitalist market of selling more and more stuff got us into this climate emergency, and it's not going to get us out of it. We need government leadership backed by democratic citizens, because we need to think of climate threat as an emergency like we did with COVID or World War II. Okay, I don't know if you know this, but Canada is by far the worst G7 laggard in cutting climate pollution. So if we go back to the 1990 level, and that at the Rio and in the Kyoto agreement in the 1997, they went back to, they say all the governments promised they would reduce emissions from the 1990 level. So that became the base year. Where is Canada? We have risen our emissions by 21%. The United States and Japan is about the same level as they were in 1990. The European Union is down by 25%, and Britain is down by 42%. So we are the G7 bad boy. Now, why are we? Well, you know, we keep hearing about carbon taxes and consumption. Those are important things. But the biggest source of emissions in Canada comes from oil and gas, and that's in the top right corner of the screen there. That is bigger, emissions are slightly larger than from all forms of transportation in Canada. And those oil and gas emissions are actually underestimated because, for example, in the tar sands, they asked the companies to estimate what their emissions are. And an Environment Canada plane flew over, and in some places they had underestimated by 60% what their emissions were. So this is why we are not tackling, we keep talking about consumption, which is important, but we have to tackle the production of oil and gas. So this graph compares the provinces from 2005 to 2019 and their level of emissions. So the green is the 2005 and the gray is 2019. So all of the provinces are there. Now, if Newfoundland is an oil producer, so it's on the extreme left there. It has not gone down, but all of the provinces in Eastern Canada and other ones have gone down. Ontario actually the most, and that was when McGuinty closed the coal-fired electric generation plants. But those, while Ontario and other provinces were cutting their emissions, those were the consuming provinces. The Alberta and Saskatchewan were raising those and took up the whole level that the other provinces had cut it by. So here it is. Since 2005, you can see on the left side there, Ontario reduced its emissions by 45 megatons, and Quebec and Nova Scotia did a certain amount. But Alberta and Saskatchewan, and then the oil sands itself, jacked up their emissions by 45 tons, which is exactly the same as Ontario cut their emissions. So how big foreign oil hinders climate action in Alberta and Canada? Well, big foreign oil captures the lion's share of the industry, of its governance and policy making and profits, and it asserts its power through the control of CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and there's some other oil lobby groups as well. It exercises especially influence over the Alberta government, which if it doesn't get its way, there's often talks about separating from Canada and Western alienation, all of those things. And it influences those governments, big oil does, whether it's a Conservative or NDP government in Alberta. And the governments are vulnerable because of Alberta's acute dependence on oil and gas. So big oil accrues a social license. It tries to get a social license, meaning getting support from the public, and to try and deepen the notion that Albertans' identity and interests are inextricably linked to oil. Just look at I used to go to the Oilers games when Gretzky was there and Messier and all those great players. You know, the first thing they do is they bring an oil derrick down on top of center ice. And Oilers, you know, this is people identify Alberta, Edmonton with the oil industry. And of course, they also scapegoat the critics of environmental critics of oil and gas industry. Well, I want to talk about the Alberta War Room and public inquiry. I'm going to talk about this a lot in the presentation. Before that, there was the NDP was in power from 2015 to 2019. So there was an election in 2019, and Kenny had come back from being a cabinet minister in the Harper government, and he helped to form the United Conservative Party, brought together two right-wing parties. And before the 2019 election, Tim McMillan, who was the CEO of CAP, called for a campaign against what he called foreign-funded anti-pipeline activists. Well, despite representing some of the richest corporations in the world, he actually presents CAP as victim we have been the victims of a very well orchestrated, well planned, foreign funded attack on Canadian infrastructure on pipelines and LNG facilities. Well, that was just before the election. Then Kenney picks that up, runs the election on that platform, and then promises to bring in a war room and a public inquiry to look into this conspiracy that the CEO is talking about. Now, just to the reason that the oil industry was so incensed about environmentalists is that the environmentalists were very successful in portraying the tar sands accurately as dirty oil, that labeled dirty oil. So what they did, it was actually the oil industry which brought on the knowledge in the United States, the sort of the visibility of it. They put this giant truck, a truck just like this, right near Capitol Hill in Washington, just to brag about their, this incredible thing. Well, the tar sands were this obscure, for Americans, this obscure project in a far off part of Alberta. Well, it became central. And then National Geographic magazine, I couldn't get the exact, but on the front cover of their magazine in 2009, they had a picture very much like this. I couldn't get the exact picture because it's under copyright, but it was very much like that. So the CAP wraps itself, it pretends it's Canadian. I'm going to show how foreign owned it is and foreign funded, but they use the maple leaf as fig leaf to cover up really who they are. And it's a bit rich for CAP to use Canadian nationalist rhetoric to defend them, portray themselves as acting in Canadian and Alberta interests. Because CAP's board of governors is overwhelmingly dominated by foreign-owned and foreign-funded corporations. Well, CAP, right, they got the name Canadian there, and they always fly the flag, and they pretend that their policies, oil policies, are made in Canada. So when Kenney got elected in 2019 in the United Conservative Party, they set up this what they call a public inquiry. It wasn't really a public inquiry because they never called in anybody went to testify in front of it. It was just a Google search. But so Kenney alleged that there was this foreign-funded conspiracy to landlock Alberta oil. And so there was this inquiry. It kept getting delayed, but it finally came out. It reported. It was released in October. And the investigation found only peanuts amount of money that went into it. So the actual money that they went into what they called the anti-Alberta energy campaign, they found that the annual flow of money was a little bit less than the cost of the public inquiry itself. So why would you hold a public inquiry on a flow of money that is so small, it's even smaller than the cost of the public inquiry? But they then left off what should have been the main concern of foreign funding. So when the inquiry was released, Jason Kenney had been front and center in the election campaign and announcing the public inquiry. When the report came out, it was embarrassing about how little it was. He was nowhere to be seen, and neither was the commissioner, Steve Allen, who did the inquiry. But they put Sonia Savage, and she's in the picture there. She is the energy minister. And she was, saying that, well, the amount of money isn't a lot, but it's a real concern. And I quote from her: "When any group is influencing political and regulatory change using foreign funding," well, I actually agree with her, especially if it's a large sum. Well, then why didn't the public inquiry target? Why did it target a molehill and miss the Rockies? So I decided to look, and I've done this through the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives and the Council of Canadians. looking at the influence of foreign-funded petrocorporations. This is what the Alberta government should have been doing. So, and they've got a lot of money in order to spend on this cap. It doesn't make its budget public, but it's estimated anywhere from $20 to $50 million a year. There has been no major Canadian Canadian-owned oil corporation since Suncor took over Petro-Canada in 2009. Now, I want to do a prequel here. Remind you of this guy. You see this guy on the right, remember him? Well, his government, actually, the Harper government, launched the tax in 2012 against foreign-funded environmentalists. They had their natural resource minister, Joe Oliver. He opened the attack and he said against what he called environmental and other radical groups who use funding from foreign special interest groups to hijack our regulatory system. Well, Canada was actually the global pioneer in targeting environmentalists on national security lines, saying basically that these people are, insinuating that they are traitors to the country. Soon we had Putin in Russia, Modi in India, and Bolsonaro in Brazil following suit and calling environmentalists foreign agents. Well, the Harper government launched, I don't know if you remember this, is the CRA audits of Canadian charities to root out what their foreign funds, saying that they're getting tax breaks to attack the oil industry. They did 5 years of audits. They found nothing, basically. There were very few misconducts found. But that wasn't the point. The point was to, just by smearing the environmentalists, to cause a chill and to legitimize environmental groups in Canadians' eyes. Well, I want to introduce you now to another figure, Vivian Crow. She's important in the story of the public inquiry. In 2011, Stephen Harper whisked Crouse from obscurity and pounced on her conspiracy theory. I think they pounced on her theory because she was a single mom. She wasn't sort of the big oil industry. She worked as a public relations officer for the fish farm industry in British Columbia. She lived in Vancouver. And so it didn't look like sort of big bad oil. But she came up with a theory that US-based foundations bankrolled the tar sands campaign to quit what she said landlocked Canadian oil. And she said that the funded tar sands campaign uses exaggeration and outright falsehoods to sabotage interprovincial pipelines and prevent Western oil from getting to Tidewater. So Canadian oil was getting into the United States through pipelines, but the oil industry wanted to be able to sell it to other countries and not just to the American market, especially since the Keystone XL pipeline was stopped. And she said that the anti-pipeline activism, it's not really about climate. That's just what they pretend. It's really about US economic protectionism. Well, so she uses, she's not an academic researcher. She's not a journalist. This isn't her area, but she goes in and does her research, and it's a pretty weird theory. So she contended that it's the campaign, the tar sands campaign promoted interests of U.S. oil corporate companies, and it was led by the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation or Fund, and of course, as you remember, John D. Rockefeller was the guy who kind of basically started what became ExxonMobil. So it'd be ironic that they would. So anyway, so she talks about these American funds were funding environmentalists in Canada. But she did in 2016, that was her accusation. A few months ago, she seemed to do about a turn. She said, I never accused the environmental groups of being used by US interests to further the oil industry, US oil industry. I haven't seen any evidence of that. I'm going to introduce you now to Sandy Garisino, who is one of Canada's best investigative journalists. She writes for the National Observer. She's a lawyer and former Crown prosecutor, as well as a journalist. She did an in-depth study published in the National Observer to look at Krauss's conspiracy theory. She says that a conspiracy like Krauss alleges would necessarily involve senior foundation leadership acting in concert and with malice to subvert bona fide charitable objectives of their organizations. So she's talking about the Tides Foundation, all these foundations subverting what they were supposed to be doing. So Garisino looked at a site called Candid. It is a US-based site that looks at the foundations around the world, charitable organizations. And she found that of all of the funds that went from them for environmental for environmental initiatives, only 1% specifically went to climate initiatives. And of those, 59% went to the US. Canada only got 1%. They just went that much into it. So in fact, the Canadian environmentalists who were trying to stop the expansion of the tar sands because of its emissions and what it's doing to the climate. They got 1% of 1%. That's what they got, which is 1/10,000th, if you can want to do your math. So on the left here, that's just a graph that shows that Canada's that little tiny red stripe there of the climate grants. And on the right side, it's the world oil producers. Canada's number 4 as a world oil producer, 5% of the world's production. We have 1/2 of 1% of the world's people, but we produce 10 times our share of oil and then of emissions. Well, why do we take Krauss's far-fetched theory seriously? Well, it should have just been ignored because it was a crackpot theory. But it was foundational to Kenney's $30 million a year war room. So when it was launched, Alberta Energy Minister Sonia Savage stated that, quote, "Our energy room will be a platform to amplify what has been uncovered by research from Ms. Krauss and other industry stakeholders." And Vivian Crow also got not a huge sums, but she got speaking fees and funding from foreign-owned petroleum corporations. So I looked at the real source of foreign influence. For all its Calgary's bravado as being an independent center, a world center of oil and gas, we show that it is really just a very subordinate satellite kind of place. CAP waves the maple leaf, yet 77% of the corporations on its board are either fully foreign-owned or are majority foreign-owned. And foreign-owned means foreign-funded. That's what foreign ownership is about. So if you look at the foreign-owned oil corporations, they control $284 billion of assets in Canada and export over 3 million barrels of oil a day. And of course, they're continually campaigning for more oil pipelines, wanting to raise exports and ask for more subsidies. And they, as we saw, they take billions in net profits out of Canada. I tried to determine how much of CAP's revenue is foreign funded, and CAP is very secretive. It won't reveal its budget, annual budget, but we can conclude pretty conclusively that it is 97% foreign funded, and this is how. On their site, the CAP's revenue comes from corporate membership fees, and it's based on the level of oil production. So the higher the more oil they produce, the more they have to pay in fees to CAP. And all of the big oil companies are either majority or fully foreign owned. And we know that 97% of the oil produced by corporations on CAP's board comes from foreign-owned corporations. So we can assume that those corporations supply about 97% of CAP's revenue. Now, I'm going to talk soon about how Canada has a rule to stop foreign money interfering in our elections, but CAP has figured out a way. At the moment, they're still getting around it. I want to switch to what is happening, as a similar debate that is happening in the United States to try and ban big corporations, foreign-owned corporations, from influencing American elections. So this is Ellen Weintraub. She is chair of the US Federal Election Commission. And so she wrote in a New York Times op-ed, and I quote, "Individual foreigners are barred from spending to sway elections." So that's in their law. It defies logic to allow groups of foreigners or foreigners in combination with American citizens to fund political spending through corporations. Well, in my study, I recommend that we ban foreign influence corporations from making financial contributions to Canadian political parties and to register as third parties in elections. Third parties are allowed to spend $1 million in the pre-election period and $500,000 during the election. So there is this, how do you determine what is a foreign influence corporation? This is the threshold that I'm recommending. And I took this actually from House of Representatives bill supported by the Democrats. All the Democrats in the House of Reps in 2019 voted for this. And it was 5% of a foreign government owned 5% or more. If a single foreign shareholder owned 20%, or if the total foreign ownership was 50%. The Democrats last month reintroduced this bill, but made the thresholds much tighter than that. They talk about 1% government shareholder, etc. So, anyways, now why do you think why is 1% important? Well, the U.S. Security and Exchanges Commission says that if any investor owns 1% of a corporation, can communicate directly with its managers, and so that it matters who they are. I'm going to introduce you to John C. Coates, who is a Harvard law professor, but he's now the acting director of Securities and Exchange Commission in the U.S. So he goes in, and this is how he talks about fiduciary duty. That it's the manager's primary obligation is to maximize profits for shareholders. And he said stockholders invest to receive a good return, not for any common good. And when a company is owned by foreigners, the domestic managers, even if they're domestic, would violate their fiduciary duties if they did not represent the best interests of their foreign owners. And he goes on he's somebody who wants to regulate foreign influenced corporations. And he said that foreign influence does not rest on the idea that foreign investors are necessarily tied to hostile governments. Well, what is the theory behind this? Well, we live in a democracy, at least as much as possible, that this is a democracy. What is democratic self-government? Well, the principle is that the citizens rule themselves and they control their own affairs, free from outside interference. Whatever democratic jurisdiction you're in, that should be the case. This should apply around the world. Corporations, of course, are not persons, and they should have no citizen rights. Now, if the owners, and some of the owners are citizens, are Canadians, and if the managers are citizens, they should have the same right as anybody else. But of course, getting foreign funded means that their voice is so much more amplified than for other ordinary Canadian citizens. But corporations should not have any citizen rights. So I went into to find out the corporations on CAP's board, the 2020 board. I went into Bloomberg Terminals to look at all these companies on their board. This is research I did with, got some help from an environmental group in San Francisco who did it pro bono, Rain Action, Rainforest Network. So there were 48 corporations on CAP's board. We don't know, we can't really decide if it's foreign controlled. We know that it's foreign influence, foreign funded. We don't know what the decision making is. Corporations are very secretive. But the important thing is, whether it is foreign influenced and foreign funded. And we know that, we can see. We have data on that, the residence of the majority of the owners. What I found of these 48 corporate board members, 37 were confirmed or likely majority foreign owned. 16 of those 37 were actually foreign subsidiaries, so they were 100% foreign owned. Of the 20 that were not subsidiaries, 13 of those 20 we know that they were majority foreign owned. There were 7 more that were likely. When I say likely is there was of their shares sold on that were recorded on Bloomberg Terminals, it was under 50% of their shares. So but we looked at that and other information, and we have concluded that they are very likely foreign owned. So when you add them all together, 77% of CAP's board is either majority foreign owned or fully foreign owned. Now I'm not going to go into this in any detail here, but these are the foreign owned subsidiaries. The third column there shows the percentage of foreign ownership. And, like the first one, Petronas, Mark Fitzgerald had been a past chair of CAP. It's owned in Malaysia. These are corporations that are not subsidiaries, but are majority foreign owned. And again, that third column shows the percentage of foreign ownership. And the final category are privately held corporations that are on CAP's board. These are the small guys. These are the guys in conventional oil, not in the tar sands. This is where Canadian ownership comes in. And this is, like they produce something like 3% of the oil of the members on CAP's board. So I'm not going to go into any details on those. I want to get into petronationalism, the way CAP uses nationalism, Canadian nationalism. Well, I don't know if you remember Jim Prentice. He was the environmental minister in the Harper government and briefly became premier of Alberta. He made a speech and talked about his vision of a Canadian extractivist nationalism. And he said that we should take pride in who we are and what we do. We extract resources from our abundant natural deposits and rely on the proceeds to help provide an exceptional standard of living. We are blessed in every sense to profit. Will Prentice's vision is the opposite of the long Canadian conquest right after Confederation for Canada to escape its colonial status, economic status as hewers of wood and drawers of water. So what Prentice is saying is we should embrace just being hewers of wood and drawers of water. Well, another term for populist nationalism is extractivist populism. These are interchangeable terms. It celebrates resource exporting as a patriotic good, and they mobilize the oil corporations, the public, to defend the oil industry, and they portray themselves as being under unfair attack by liberal elites who are trying to block the industry from serving the common good. And so they've got this whole idea of the populist, the common wisdom of the people derived from their lived experience. Now, this portrayal is so far from reality. What we have in essence, and I'm going to quote here from Shane Gunster, who's a Simon Fraser University professor who has looked at extractivist populism. As he says, fossil fuel industry in Canada is corporate-driven, for-profit capitalist enterprise, managed and operated first and foremost for the interests of often global shareholders. And he says, but that's the reality. But wherever you look, it appears if this industry has been nationalized and run to serve the interests of all Canadians. That's how big oil portrays it. CAP was losing, and big oil was losing the PR battle with the environmentalists on the tar sands. So they decided to develop a group called Energy Citizens, or Canada's Energy Citizens. And they actually got this idea from the API, the American Petroleum Institute, which 5 years before CAP produced its own Energy Citizens group. API had a group called Energy Citizens. And CAP just put the word Canada's Energy Citizens in front of that. So what they do is they mobilize people with symbols like that. I love Canadian energy. They mobilize people who believe that their well-being and way of life depends on extractivism. And I've met a number of these people, and there quite a number. A number of them are genuine. I've had discussions with them, and they really believe in this stuff. And so and it's much more effective for the oil corporations to recruit ordinary citizens. So they get industry workers, their communities, conservatives generally, and they form, this is really a subsidized grassroots like lobby group. Canada's Energy Citizens, very active on social media. They're every day they're sending out messages when anybody attacks the tar sands, and they are presenting their views. CAP attempts to gain social license, and this assumes they assume that government approval isn't sufficient, that you actually must win over what they call stakeholders to get the projects approved. And they try and get it on economic grounds. They provide jobs, social, political, their identification with the province, and other dimensions. But they're having increasing trouble doing this because they are, and this I'm using this word demanning. It's not a term, that's not my term. It's a bit sexist in its agenda there. But CAP, they are cutting the jobs in the oil sands, so that they're producing more and more oil with fewer and fewer workers. And the oil and gas industry directly employs fewer than 1% of all Canadian workers. So they're actually going to start losing the economic legitimacy side of that. But they have convinced quite a number across Canada that the oil sector is crucial to Canadians' economic well-being, and that's the purpose of their campaigns. And they've had a special success in Saskatchewan and Alberta in doing that, less success elsewhere. So astroturf groups, you know what astroturf is. You use this stuff to cover soccer fields or sports fields instead of real grass. Well, what the metaphor is that this is fake grassroots groups. So we've talked about Canada's Energy Citizens. They rely on real citizens, and they especially get people who, as I say, from oil workers, middle-aged, white, conservative men. It is CAP funded, and they so these full-time staff paid for by CAP go out to directly meet potential recruits. And they talk about how they, got a motivated group and how they are trying to get people to speak up and to feel that their views are validated. They're pro-oil groups, and they've got they're on Facebook, over 250,000 likes and followers according to the site. How grassroots is it? Well, some in a genuine grassroots group, the members decide on policy, leadership, and direction. But in the Canada's Energy Citizens, they're basically passive supporters. One person who was profiled on their site said, "I honestly didn't realize my profile was on their site." So it's not pure astroturf, but it's you really have to ask whether if CAP hadn't funded and directed it, would the Canada's Energy Citizens even formed, let alone become effective, if it was a citizen-initiated group. There are many other grassroots pro-oil industry groups there, and they've got Canadian names. Often they're just copying their American counterparts. So much for Canadian nationalism. Canada's Action is probably the most effective group. I'm not going to go into it. They claim to be totally grassroots, no support from the oil industry. But it was revealed that one of the big oil companies gave them a $100,000 donation, and it undercut their credibility. Well, what does CAP do? Well, it got some advice from the American Petroleum Institute on how to micro-target campaigns using flyers, finding voter profiles. It went into the 2019, CAP went in the 2019 election. It built a network of subsidized grassroots groups, and they campaigned in the last two federal elections on something called Vote Energy, which basically was saying vote conservative. Well, CAP has claims to be nonpartisan, but they congratulated Jason Kenney's government when they were elected, and they congratulated his promise to create a war room. So meeting with a potential winner of the next federal election is a pinnacle of political influence. So before the 2019 federal election, CAP held a closed day-long conference with the federal conservatives, including Andrew Scheer, to strategize how to oust the Trudeau Liberals. And here are some of the topics that they discussed. How to sue environmental groups to silence oil industry critics. How to rally the base using these pro-oil front groups. How to push for more pipelines, lower corporate tax, and they say less regulation. They always mean environmental regulation, less of that. And it was Tim McMillan, who is the CEO of CAP, introduced a panel that was called Paths to a Federal Election Victory. That is with the Conservative Party. And CAP registered as a third party in both the 2019 and 2021 federal elections. And they carried out disinformation campaign. They made two very provably false claims in that election. One of them was that Canada's only credible path to meeting the Paris commitments is through the increased exports of Canadian natural gas. And they wanted the government to acknowledge that Canada's oil and natural gas sector is not subsidized, even though it's subsidized to the tune of $18 billion. So this is disinformation kind of campaigns. So I looked at political donations to Alberta's political parties by oil corporations, and some of the biggest, Ovintiv, which is a natural gas corporation based in Denver, and other two are major oil sands corporations, and looked at the donations they made. Most of the donations went to the conservatives, progressive conservatives. Some went to the Wild Rose Alliance, which is even to the right of the progressive conservatives, and some to the Alberta Liberals. None, not even $1, went to the NDP. Well, when the NDP Notley government was in power, they banned corporate. So that was donations before 2015. But the Notley government banned corporate and union donations, and they limited individual donations to $4,000 a year. But so Big Foreign Oil found ways of getting around this. They rerouted some money through opaque channels, perhaps not quite as much, but they tended to do it as individuals, getting their families, their spouses to give money up to the limits. And the money went overwhelmingly to conservative parties. This was money that went to Kenny's leadership campaign to become the head of the United Conservative Party. A lot of this was from the conventional oil industry in Alberta. Okay, I'm just getting near the end here. What else do? They do lobbying. CAP met with the federal conservatives, as we saw, but they never, even though they were pro-conservative, they never gave up trying to influence the federal Liberal government, and they've done a good job in actually influencing it. They continually lobby federal government officials. So, for example, from 2011 to 2018, there were almost 10,000 contacts between the oil industry and federal government officials, and this overlaps the Harper and Trudeau governments. That's over 5 meetings per working day on average over the period. So they are in perpetual lobbying. The CAP has 36 full-time lobbyists, and individual corporations also have their own lobbyists. Why do you lobby? Well, you want to, as they say, saturate the intellectual environment. You've got your perspective, and you refute any other perspectives, for example, environmental ones. CAP set up a secret committee with government, Alberta and federal governments in 2010, and it happened again at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. When COVID struck, CAP got the federal government to form this working group that was called Create the Path. And the individuals are on the right there. The top one, his name is a bit cut off, but he was the Minister of Natural Resources, Seamus O'Regan. And they included the Deputy Minister, which is the top federal bureaucrat of those 4 departments. And then these CAP members, all of these are foreign-owned corporations, including Tim McMillan, who's the head of CAP. What did this Follow the Path committee do? Well, their objectives, and they agreed, as the government bureaucrats and the oil companies, keep the industry active and viable, preserve jobs and encourage investment, reduce the operating costs and regulatory burden. Then they added some priorities, supporting offshore oil. I guess that's Seamus O'Regan was from Newfoundland, LNG, tar sands, and to support the tar sands as central to any economic recovery. That was what this committee talked about. Of course, environmental groups don't have any access in a similar way. Now, the Follow the Path committee didn't have success in everything. CAP actually tried to get laws to delay the law to protect Indigenous rights, to delay reporting on their lobbying, and to delay federal plans to fight climate change. They didn't win on those, but they did have success on getting the government to promote new pipeline and carbon fuel projects, doubling taxpayer handouts to corporations, delaying the clean fuel standard, and agreeing to pay from taxpayer money $1.7 billion to clean up orphan wells, the mess that the oil companies have left in Alberta, instead of cleaning up their own mess, polluter pay. We saw why Canada was a G7 laggard. Canada has not limited oil and gas production or their emissions at all. Those production is going up, and with that production, the emissions are rising. Canada did not join in the COP meetings. There was an initiative by Denmark and Costa Rica called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and these countries have agreed to phase out oil and gas production and exploration permits. As we saw, the production of oil and gas is more than 1/4 of Canada's total. What we need is a just transition plans so that the workers and the communities are taken care of and moving on to other industries, other activities. Now, Canada just recently, with new ministers, Environment Minister and Natural Resources Minister, including Stephen Guilbeault, they've promised to cap and steadily reduce oil and gas emissions, not production. But beware of the loophole. When the oil industry talks about that, what they want is carbon capture, carbon offsets to produce as much as they've been doing, and then for the public to pay for to capture that carbon. Okay, just finishing here. How do we curb foreign funding influence? We should ban foreign corporations from third-party advertising, prohibit foreign influence corporations from funding election interventions. We should reduce the individual political donations per annum to 500 a year, and Alberta is now, I think, about 4,300, well, 4,200 there. In Ontario, it's 3,300. We should prohibit the deceptive representations for the purpose of promoting a political party and their deceptive advertising, just like the Competition Bureau does. And of course, end all subsidies. Final recommendations, need to gradually phase out oil and gas production in Canada. We should start first and fastest to end oil and gas exports. 2/3 of our oil is producer export, not for Canadians' needs. So we could phase that out much more quickly. Canadians, I'm afraid, will still be using oil into the 2030s, but we should be scaling that back down at the same rate as we scaled back Canadian production. There should be generous supports for oil and gas workers. We should reshore industries to Canada. COVID showed that the global supply lines can't keep us safe and they're unreliable. We should be making strategic things in Canada again, medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, other things. And this is something if, the Republicans take over the Congress and Senate in 2022, and if Trump wins in 2024, Canada's economic integration with the US is going to make it hard for us to maintain democracy in this country. We'll be subject to economic blackmail. Okay, final thing, what we need is a World War II COVID scale action for the climate emergency. And these principles are taken from Seth Klein, his book, The Good War. It's a great book if you haven't read it yet. 1, spend what it takes to win. And this is what we did in the Second World War, and we did it with COVID. Creates new economic institutions to get the job done. 3, shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. 4, tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. We did all of those things in the Second World War and with COVID, and the federal and provincial governments are failing on all those counts. We have to make them do it. Well, we need an identity shift. So instead of the Oilers, this is my new logo for them, the Edmonton Solars. Now here is someone who, like me, who's saying we got to do something about climate change, and this is what we can get: energy independence, preserve rainforests, livable cities, renewables, healthy children, etc. And a man stands up, a man in the back says, what if it's a hoax and we create a better world for nothing? So anyways, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Gordon, for that. That was a very useful framework for thinking about how big foreign oil casts itself as being Canadians and the methods it uses to control energy and climate policy in this country. As we indicated before, we're going to start the Q&A section by going to some first commenters, and I'm going to go first to Sue McKenzie from CAM. Sue, are you ready to ask your first, or pose your first comment and ask your first question?
Yes, yes, I am ready. You can hear me.
All yours.
Okay. Good evening, Gordon.
Hi.
4 events occurred this week that were of concern, and they all put together demonstrate big foreign oil's impact on Canada's climate policy. The first was a global witness report found that Shell's Quest carbon capture, utilization, and storage project in Alberta emits more greenhouse gases annually than it captures. The second thing was the federal government announcing it would offer a tax credit for investments in this failing CCUS technology. Third, outraged by this decision, 400 scientists and academics fired off a letter to Chrystia Freeland, Jonathan Wilkinson, and Stephen Guilbeault, asking that the tax credit plan be dropped because it represents a substantial new fossil fuel subsidy. Fourth, CAP immediately mobilized, and it called on its so-called citizens arm that you referred to, Canada Energy Citizens, to write to the feds in support of the tax credit. My question is, how can we shake the feds out of this intransigent and free of the grip of big foreign oil? And you did lay out a plan, but it's all dependent on regulations changing and laws changing. We know how long that takes. So what else can we do?
Well, good to see you, Sue. Yeah, those are great questions. You know, they're right on. The carbon capture there's a lot of false solutions. The oil industry keeps leading us down into rabbit holes that are going to do nothing or maybe even be harmful, like their carbon capture is more emissions. And, you know, the federal government is continuing. Here they've said, the federal government said they're going to stop subsidizing, but they're going to, you know, they're going to do this tax credit for the oil companies, and it will go beyond the, I think it's 2023, is it, when they said they were going to stop their subsidies? Well, we have to mobilize better than the other side. It is possible to do. We have to get, we have to get Canadians to understand what is going on. Most Canadians want action. We remember Lytton. We remember those floods in British Columbia. This is not some abstract thing. What is happening to destroying the planet and people and you know, so, but, you know, they keep, the oil industry and the governments keep baffling people. So it's important that we do this education. This is the only way to do it, is through democracy, it's through citizens that we do it. There are alternatives. I don't know if you want me, I don't want to, you know, I don't know if you want me to go into what the alternatives are, but you know, strategy, but that's probably too far afield.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that if we could basically maybe come back toward the end of the question period, if we have a little bit of time, but we only have approximately, I think, about less than 15 minutes. So I think I'd like to go on if possible. So thank you for that, Sue. Yeah. And now move up to the other Sue, Susan Hay from Environmentalists. And Susan, can you make a comment and pose a question to Gordon?
Yes, I can. I've chosen to ask a little shorter question than I had previously planned to. So back at the Paris talks, Justin Trudeau promised us that Canada was back and would be a leader in climate action. He declared a climate emergency in Canada one day and bought the Kinder Morgan pipeline the next. What was going on there?
Well, I'm afraid the Liberal government They talk a good game. They talk differently than conservatives, but they don't really act very differently. Great, Canada's back. The Trudeau government's been in power now for 6 years, a little over 6 years, and the emissions in Canada have not gone down basically at all. It's the same level. So, you can talk all these great targets, but they're not really doing anything substantially. And they are allowing the carbon tax is useful, but it's a very small measure. But they allow the growth in oil and gas production and emissions. Why do they do that? Well, the Liberals, they tend to support, the kind of free market economy and big corporations. I actually think that Justin Trudeau, because his dad, when he was Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, brought in the National Energy Program, which attempted to Canadianize the oil industry, and in fact started to move strongly to do that. He wanted to get a different image in Western Canada. He went to Calgary before he became leader of the Liberal Party to show that he wasn't his dad and that he would support them in the oil industry. There's a number of things, but they have the model in their head of resource projects. This is what Canada is, and they're afraid to, for the government to lead on the economy.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. There's a question, and it flows from something you just said. Both the NDP and the Green Party, to some extent, support cap and trade or putting a price on carbon as the main part of their a key portion of their climate plan. Is a carbon tax, in your view, the major part of a climate action plan that's actually going to work?
No, I support carbon tax, and cap and trade can be good, depends how it's developed. But here is the problem. The problem is that the 10% of the world's population produces 50% of the emissions, and the poorest part of the population produces very few emissions. And if you use a tax to try and stop the rich and the well-to-do to curb their use of energy and emissions, you would have to raise it so high that middle income and low income people couldn't get necessities like heating a home and getting to work. So that because we have such an unequal society in terms of how people make a living in the distribution of wealth, we have to do other things. I mean, we have to do basically three things. One is we do have to cut consumption, and we have to help people do that. You can't just say switch from your car. You have to have public transit alternatives or electric vehicle stations, public, buses and all that kind of thing. Okay, we have to cut consumption. We have to cut production of oil and gas, and that's not talked. I've emphasized that, but that's not talked about enough. And the third thing we have to do is we have to capture the carbon. Some of the carbon is in the air through natural means, not through technologies that don't exist, but through reforestation and the land planning, forest, that kind of way. So we need to do those three things, and we have to figure out how to cut consumption in an equitable way. And in my book, After the Sands, I talk about a quota system where everybody gets a certain quota of emissions that they can have. And it's a somewhat flexible quota system, but it's basically each year it would go down, and it would actually be a redistribution of wealth, and it would make sure that the lowest income people are taken care of while we have this plan. And that's really crucial.
Okay, so there's a question in chat by from Carrie Martin, basically saying that the only reason why the industry is producing fossil fuels is because people demand it to heat their homes, to use machines and travel further than we can on foot. those are the benefits. And she talks about the cost of the cost is future warming, versus current benefit. And she's asking, how do we factor in future costs into the present day decision making?
Hmm. Well, there's that consumer sovereignty idea that the consumers that demand stuff and the oil companies then produce. The history of the early part of this century in North America is that oil companies went in and bought up public transit systems and basically closed them down so that they could have buses and cars and other things running so that they would have the demand. So it isn't as if it's just, okay, people want this stuff. What we need is an alternative. You can't just ask people, change your means of transportation. You have to make it possible for them to do it and make it convenient, low cost, and rapid enough for them to do it. In terms of future costs, I'm not sure exactly what the point. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I don't think I want to unmute everybody in order for that question to be elaborated on. Maybe I can ask Carrie to elaborate on that in chat if she wants to, but I take it what she means is that there's a future cost.
Yeah,
it's not just future. We're currently experiencing the cost of climate disruption right now, but I take it this notion that the costs are in the future, but the benefits are immediate is the kind of trade-off that I think Carrie is talking about.
Right.
Okay, so there is a comment in chat about the fact that military emissions are completely exempt from any of the carbon accounting systems that are in place at the moment, including the UN systems for determining the appropriate shares of national emissions. Could you talk a little bit about the impact of military emissions on the climate emergency?
Well, we know they're substantial. I don't know if we know exactly how they are, because I would think that the United States was especially an actor in making sure that the military emissions were exempt. The Air Force of, the United States, Russia, China, the big powers, they keep up their planes 24/7. Can you imagine? The airplanes are worse because of where they are in terms of their emissions, being up in the troposphere. And they're just running the stuff all the time, just in case they have to be used. It's a real travesty, and we don't have enough public debate on what the military does, and we need that. What is the Canadian military doing? It's very good. We should pressure governments on this.
Okay. There's a number of comments here about how do we win the public relations battle and so on. And I don't think that we're going to have time to do any kind of an adequate focus on that kind of attention. So, and a number of people are commenting on the fact that even governments that are New Democratic Party governments, like, for example, the government of Rachel Notley or the current government in British Columbia, are adopting very pro-fossil fuel policies in embracing them as being in the public interest, and wondering what we can do to try to fight against that. You want to make some final comments on the power of the fossil fuel sector and being able to control the political dialogue that's going on, and even governments that ostensibly are not on side with that end up lining up on the side of the fossil fuel interests.
Yes, we do. We need to have a different economic model. We need to have a plan that, gets us away from the idea that Canadians, the main thing we can do in this country is just dig stuff up from the ground and ship it out. That is if we think towards the middle of this century, economies that do that are going to be in a backwater. But Canadians are well educated. go-getting people, and we can do other things. So we have to, and we have to get governments, even including NDP governments. I agree. I've been disappointed both with the Horgan government in BC and the Notley government when it was in power on this issue. They may have done other progressive things, and that was good. But on we live in a climate emergency. We have to change people's understanding of what the possibilities are, and for them, people to pressure people who are, say, active New Democrats to pressure the party in that direction, and the Green Party. So you know, it's going to take education and pressuring people, and you know, they would come along if they thought that their election victory or defeat, you know, was dependent upon that.
Okay, so we're at 9 o'clock, so I think we're going to unfortunately have to leave it there. What I'll say is about people who put questions in chat that we've not had a chance to pay attention to. We're going to look at those, and we will try to give some resources or some answers, you know, to you in the coming days with respect to those comments or questions, if you want to follow up. And so with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Claire for her to say good nights.
Okay. Before I say goodnight, I need to say a huge thank you to Gordon for telling us so many important truths and for making connections among them, and for empowering us and encouraging us as climate activists to put all the information that you have uncovered for us to use. The fact that CAP is 97% foreign owned is absolutely staggering. And the fact that you've reminded us that we still live in the Canadian extractivist nationalism, even though we are not, most of us, not in Alberta. So you can tell from the questions in the chat that you stimulated a lot of thinking. And so we thank you. So on behalf of Environment Halliburton, Climate Action Muskoka, and SCAN, thank you very much for such an enlightening and informative presentation. I'd like to just make a couple of informative pieces of information at the end. The recording of this presentation will be available on the Environment Halliburton website in about a week. That's in the chat. It's environmenthalliburton.org. And with that, I'd really like to thank that organization, especially Susan Hay and Eric Lilius, for providing such spectacular technical support for us during these presentations, and to Terry, who is our SCAN local techie. We also would like to announce that on December the 8th, David Robertson, a very a prolific member of SCAN, has produced a paper called Ford's Bogus Climate Crimes, and he will be presenting it to Environment Halliburton on December the 8th. So again, if you go to their website, you will be able to hear more about that. So with that, many thanks to all of you for attending, for your excellent questions, and stand by for more information from all of us. Good night and be well.
Thank you.